Hi, this is Mrs. Allgood, and I am here to teach you about gymnosperms today. On this screen, you can start filling in your blanks there. This is just making you aware of some of the different types of gymnosperms out there. The first one is ginkgo biloba, or ginkgo. Ginkgo trees are planted usually in more urban settings because they do fairly well with pollution. They are something called dioecious, which means there are separate male and female ginkgo biloba trees. So the females produce a structure that looks like a fruit, but since it's a gymnosperm, we know it can't be a true fruit. But the female trees, when they sprout these fruit-looking structures, they are very stinky and people don't like them. So normally in an urban setting, you will see mainly male trees planted because they don't smell as much. Next up, you see a cycad, and a cycad kind of looks like a cross between a fern and maybe a palm, and it's got these cone-like looking things in there. The next one is nite, which is the ephedra plant that you see in the lower right here. That is, like when we think of Sudafed, we think of pseudoephedrine. Okay, you don't want to take Sudafed before you go to bed because it's got a stimulant in it, so does ephedra. And the last is conifers. Conifers are what we typically associate with gymnosperms. Phylum Coniferophyta. So these are your cone-bearing trees and shrubs, and we'll talk about some adaptations that they have in order to be successful in the environments that they live in. And of course, we associate those with the coniferous forest biomes, which remember, okay, so we associate it with the coniferous forest biome that's between the tundra and the deciduous forest. So let's keep going. If I ever go too fast for you, you know you can always pause this. Okay, so let's talk about conifers since they are probably our biggest group of gymnosperms. They're the ones you're probably most familiar with. We've got pine, like we think about pine trees with pine cones. Fir, spruce, juniper, cedar, a lot of like what you would consider a Christmas tree would be a conifer, and then you've also got things like cypress and redwood. Okay, mainly these are going to be found in the northern hemisphere. And if you think about what we learned about that coniferous forest biome, you know that the trees that mainly grow there are going to have to be adapted for growth in a dry, cooler climate, meaning they don't get a whole lot of rainfall there, and then very short growing seasons. So that's one reason why they usually keep their leaves or their needles on all year round, is to maximize their rate of photosynthesis once it's more sunny, the short growing season, once that commences. Okay, so then we have how conifers are adapted for where they grow. Now, this was something that the folks who presented on the coniferous forest biome, most of them, they were supposed to include this. So most of them did. I'm just reminding you where that coniferous forest biome is. It doesn't mean we don't have conifers in other places, okay? We have conifers around here, but obviously there's a higher population of them in that biome. You can also see that some conifers have very needle-like leaves, and we'll talk about what the advantage is for that. So, the branches are structured in such a way that they will readily shed snow. We wouldn't want them to be so prone to breaking because then that would destroy sort of the structure of the coniferous tree. So the branches are usually kind of angled downward so that if snow does collect on them, they will bend rather than break, and it's also made so that the snow will just slide off. Okay, a lot of these coniferous trees have needle-like leaves on them, which provides little surface area for evaporation and water loss. You know, that's one reason why our deciduous trees tend to lose their leaves in the winter or in the fall, is because keeping them throughout the winter would not be energy efficient for them. So if the coniferous trees or evergreens are going to keep their leaves or needles, they need to be energy efficient. Okay, And like we mentioned on the last slide, they do keep their leaves all year round, and so they can start photosynthesizing as soon as the short growing season begins. Okay, so that's just a little bit about gymnosperms as a class. And next we're going to get into a little bit more about the life cycle of a gymnosperm and how it's a little bit different from what we saw with ferns and mosses last week. Okay, so first let's talk about homosporous versus heterosporous. So you probably know that the prefix homo means the same and hetero means different. Okay, so there are some types of plants out there that just produce one kind of spore. Okay, those would be our homosporous plants. And then there's other types of plants like our gymnosperms and our angiosperms that actually produce two types of spores, and so they will be heterosporous. Okay, so homosporous plants include your bryophytes and most ferns. They just produce a single type of spore. So we never went into any more detail with that as far as there being different types of spores, because there's really not any. Okay, heterosporous plants, on the other hand, are going to be your gymnosperms and your angiosperms. So they produce spores of two different sizes, and that's going to be indicated by their prefix. Okay, so they produce a larger megaspore, which is the female spore, and they produce a smaller microspore, which is the male spore. So we say that gymnosperms and angiosperms are heterosporous because they produce spores of two different sizes. And so on the next slide, we're going to look at just kind of an overview of a homosporous life cycle and then a heterosporous life cycle. And what I hope you see is that there's just a little bit more detail with the heterosporous life cycles. It's still following the same general pattern that you learned about last week. Okay, so it says homospory versus heterospory. So this is the typical life cycle of a homosporous plant, like a moss or a fern. So you may want to write that underneath there. And then this would be the life cycle of a heterosporous plant. So a couple things are different here. One is that notice what's boxed. You have a microspore and a megaspore. And then what's also different is what they can become. So the microspore is going to become the microgametophyte, which is going to be the male gametophyte. And the megaspore is going to become the megagametophyte, which is the female gametophyte. Okay, so we have two different spores becoming two different gametophytes. And so that's going to be sort of a common theme when we talk about gymnosperms and angiosperms. Okay, so let's talk about heterospory in gymnosperms. It says one type of spore, the megaspore, develops into the female gametophyte. Now remember what you learned about last week. Remember that we said gametophytes make gametes. So specifically here, that female gametophyte, or megagametophyte as we'll talk about it, produces eggs. And then the other type of spore, the microspore, is going to develop into the male gametophyte. And once again, remember, gametophytes make gametes. So the gamete that it's going to produce is going to be the sperm cell. Okay, so pine tree basics. Remember we talked about the sporophyte generation and the gametophyte generation last week. The only organism in which the gametophyte generation is dominant or the most prevalent is going to be a moss. So in ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms, the most prevalent generation is going to be the sporophyte generation. So the pine tree that you see is going to be a sporophyte. A pine tree has female cones and male cones. So in that picture, you can see the difference there. Usually the male cones are located at the ends of the branches, and they don't really look like cones at all. They're very brittle sort of structures. And then female cones are usually located along the branch. Okay, so remember that for your project, you need to take a picture of both male and female cones from the same tree, whether it's a pine tree or some other tree. I went on a tree tour, I guess you could call it, this weekend, and we saw male and female cones from a Chinese fir tree, which was really interesting, and they were much smaller. So it doesn't have to be from a pine tree, but that is probably the easiest to find around here. So let's take a look at a representative gymnosperm life cycle, and then we will go through the process step by step. Okay? Oh, so where do we want to start? We'll start up here. Since the sporophyte is what you're used to seeing, we're going to start with the sporophyte. So remember that your sporophyte is diploid. Okay? And so what you're going to make here is, notice in this picture that that is a female cone. Okay? So the female cone on the sporophyte, which is the pine tree that you're used to seeing, is going to produce megaspores. Now remember, notice over here that spores are haploid. So if we're going from a diploid sporophyte to a haploid megaspore or microspore, that process is going to have to be meiosis occurring. Okay? So the sporophyte is the dominant generation. It's the one you're used to seeing. But what we're saying is, in the female cone, you're going to have cells that undergo meiosis to produce megaspores. And then in the male cones, which are typically located on the ends of the branches, they're going to undergo meiosis to become the microspores. Now, you might remember from what we learned last week that the megaspore and the microspore become, the megaspore becomes the megagametophyte. Now, this is the first time you're seeing those terms, but we did talk about how spores basically can be released from the sporophyte or from the sporangium, like we talked about with mosses and ferns. And then they can undergo mitosis to become a gametophyte. So here we're just being more specific. Remember that gymnosperms are heterosporous. So they're going to make megaspores and microspores, which means that those spores have to become two different things. So the megaspore develops into the megagametophyte, and then the microspore is going to develop into the microgametophyte. And that would just be by mitosis, because the spores are haploid and the gametophytes are haploid. So haploid to haploid means that mitosis is occurring here, if you want to write it right there. Okay? And then just remember what a gametophyte produces. A gametophyte produces gametes, but you got to know which one produces which gamete. So the megagametophyte, mega is female, so it's going to produce the egg cells. And then the microgametophyte, micro is male, that's going to produce the sperm cells. Now we know that sperm cells and egg cells are haploid, and so are the mega and microgametophytes. So if you're going haploid to haploid, that's going to be mitosis. Okay, and then I added in a step here. I added in pollination. We're going to talk about the difference between pollination and fertilization and the lapse of time between those. So you might want to add in pollination right there. And then this blank will be fertilization. And then through fertilization, you can make a diploid zygote or embryo, which will be packaged inside a seed, okay? And then that seed can develop by mitosis to become the sporophyte, because the zygote is diploid and the sporophyte is diploid. So if you're going from diploid something to diploid something, that's going to be mitosis that's occurring. All right, so as we go through this life cycle step by step, just remember, you do have some terminology here. So yes, when you're dealing with megaspores and microspores and megagametophytes and microgametophytes, that can get a little more confusing. But if you learned, like you were supposed to have a quiz today, if you learned the life cycles from last week, then this shouldn't be too much to add in. At least that's what I'm hoping. Okay, so pine tree life cycle. We're going to start with the sporophyte like we did on that last slide. So diploid cells from the male pine cone of the sporophyte, which is the pine tree that you're used to seeing, will undergo meiosis to produce haploid microspores. So if you're going from a diploid cell in the male pine cone to a haploid microspore, you're going from diploid to haploid. That's got to be meiosis that's occurring there. Okay, moving on. Let's just talk a little bit about this at a time. Okay, so we're continuing on the male side of things. The haploid microspores undergo mitosis to produce haploid pollen grains. So pollen is going to be a new thing for us today. Last week, we didn't talk about pollen because mosses and ferns don't use pollen to reproduce. Okay, they used the flagellated sperm, remember, which had to swim in the droplet of water. We may still have sperm here. Usually pollen grains produce sperm, but because you have a pollen grain, you do not need that thin film of water for it to swim in. So haploid microspores undergo mitosis to produce haploid pollen grains. So because we're going from haploid something to haploid something, that is going to be mitosis. And so this is the part that you just sort of have to remember. Remember we said that spores become the gametophyte. Okay? You can look back to any plant life cycle that we've done. The spores become the gametophyte. So here, the microspore is becoming the male gametophyte or the microgametophyte. So that means that pollen is the male gametophyte. And then because you already know that gametophytes make gametes, that means that the pollen grain, cells inside that pollen grain are going to be able to produce sperm cells. Okay? So that may take you going back and listening to that one more time. Remember that spores are going to become the gametophyte. And so if I'm telling you here that spores are going to undergo mitosis to become pollen grains, then that means pollen is the male gametophyte, or microgametophyte is another name for that. And so just keep in mind what gametophytes do. They make gametes. And so because we're talking about the male side of things here, the male gametophyte or the microgametophyte, which is the pollen grain, is going to produce sperm cells. All right, so you see my little picture in there. You may want to draw that. I'll explain that in a second. because we're going to talk about ovules, and we'll talk about something called a micropyle and then an egg. So I need you to see that an ovule and an egg are indeed two different structures. Just take a second to draw that. You can pause this if you want, but I'm going to keep talking. Okay, so switching to the female side of things. A female cone from the sporophyte, right, because the sporophyte's the pine tree that we're used to seeing, it's going to contain ovules deep down in between the scales of the pine cone. Okay, so it's showing you a female cone here, and then it's going to contain these ovules deep down in the scale of the cone, and then inside that ovule will be some eggs. Okay? And so that's basically what I drew here. This green thing is an ovule, there's some eggs inside, and then the opening to the ovule is called the micropyle. You had that in your vocabulary from last week. So we're kind of mirroring what we talked about on the male side of things. Diploid cells within the ovules are going to undergo meiosis to produce haploid megaspore cells. Because remember, we're talking about the sporophyte, specifically female cones on the sporophyte, even more specifically, diploid cells within that female cone on the sporophyte. So sporophytes make spores. So in this case, we're saying, well, we've got sort of different terminology for male and female. So diploid cells within the ovules of the female cone are going to undergo meiosis to produce haploid megaspore cells. So the sporophyte, remember, is always diploid. You are making haploid spores, therefore meiosis has to be occurring. Okay, so this has some different pictures than what you have. You have this picture over here, I think. This is just another one I found. Okay, so this is just telling you what's going to happen to those megaspores. Remember that spores become the gametophyte. So the haploid megaspore is going to undergo mitosis to produce the haploid megagametophyte. And that megagametophyte is within the ovule. So one of the reasons I tend to draw a lot of pictures for this cycle is because I think when we look at pre-made pictures, that can be kind of confusing. Okay? I just want you to see here, like the microspore becomes the microgametophyte, which makes the sperm. Okay, the megaspore becomes the megagametophyte, which makes the egg. Now, we already said that the microgametophyte is the pollen grain. Okay, so then people always ask me and they say, well, what's the megagametophyte then? Well, it's technically something called the embryo sac. And that probably won't make a whole lot more sense until we talk about the angiosperm life cycle on Wednesday. But in case you're dying to know what the megagametophyte is, it is the embryo sac. And so the megagametophyte, of course, a gametophyte makes gametes, so it's going to make egg cells. You already know that the microgametophyte makes sperm cells, so I don't think you need to get that down. All right, so where we're at. We have had the microgametophyte make sperm cells, and we've had the megagametophyte make egg cells. And so we know that once we have sperm and egg cells, we should have fertilization. But before that, we have something called pollination. Okay? Pollination is where a little pollen tube forms that kind of introduces the sperm cell to where the ovule is, to the opening in the ovule, which is the micropyle. Okay, so let's see what kind of picture I drew here. So the next thing that's got to happen is that pollination has to occur. Okay, so once again, this is our ovule. The opening in the ovule is called the micropyle. And so a pollen grain can land and enter the ovule. And remember, the pollen grain is the male gametophyte or the microgametophyte. Microgametophytes make sperm cells. So I know this seems really weird, but you'd think, okay, well, pollen grain lands on and enters the ovule at a site called the micropyle. And even though the egg is not a really far distance away, okay, the time it takes between pollination and fertilization is typically about 12 to 15 months. And we don't know why that takes so long. Okay, all we're talking about, if you look in this picture, is we're looking at a pollen grain landing on or near the micropyle of the ovule. And then, yes, we know a pollen tube has to form because that pollen grain, which is the microgametophyte, is going to make sperm cells that are going to need to go fertilize these egg cells. Well, apparently, getting from the micropyle to those egg cells takes 12 to 15 months. And this is just something weird that gymnosperms do. Angiosperms don't have this time lapse, but in a gymnosperm, in a conifer, there is going to be a 12 to 15 month gap between when the pollen lands near the ovule and when fertilization actually happens. So how did the pollen get there? Probably by wind, at least as far as this goes. Okay, so then fertilization will occur 12 to 15 months later, and then you'll have your haploid sperm and egg combined to form a diploid zygote. Okay, guys, sorry, I had to pause it a second and go to a meeting. Up top on that page, you can see that a seed consists of three things. So a seed will consist of the embryo, the food supply, and then a seed coat. So those are the three things that make up a seed. All right, so now once we waited about 12 to 15 months after pollination, then we said fertilization could happen. The zygote divides by mitosis to become an early embryo. As we just mentioned, the embryo is contained within the seed. The seed consists of the embryo, the food supply, and the seed coat. Okay, and then the seed can fall to the ground or it can be dispersed by wind or animal. Remember we said the pollen would normally be dispersed by wind. Here, this could be wind or animal. And when conditions are favorable, it germinates. So usually that seed has to take on some water in order to be able to germinate, which is going to allow the embryo to start growing. And then eventually the embryo will grow into a new tree, which will be your sporophyte generation. Okay, so we've only got one more slide left, I believe, which is our full-blown cycle. Okay, so I think we're going to start down here at the bottom because we've been starting with what you can see, which should be the sporophyte. Okay. So sporophyte, remember the sporophyte's diploid. Now you don't have these two boxes here, so you may want to go ahead and draw those two boxes in, because what we're doing here is we're saying, well, it's not just the sporophyte, it is the female cone on the sporophyte, or diploid cells within the female cone on the sporophyte. So that's what that's going to say in that box. Diploid cells in the female cone and then this is going to be diploid cells in the male cone. Okay, so keep in mind that sporophytes make spores, but we said that gymnosperms are heterosporous, which means they make two different kinds of spores. So the diploid cells in the female cone should be producing your megaspores. Okay, and the diploid cells in the male cone should be producing your microspores. Now, because we're going from a diploid sporophyte to haploid mega and microspores, you should know that this is going to be meiosis that's occurring here. Okay, now remember we said that the spores become the gametophyte. Okay, so the megaspore is going to become the megagametophyte, which is also haploid. So the megaspore is haploid, the megagametophyte is haploid. And then the microspore, which is on the male side of things, is going to become the microgametophyte. Now remember, the microgametophyte is your pollen grain. So remember what you should do to practice this. You should be giving yourself a word bank and practice drawing it till you can do it with no problem without glancing at your notes. Now, as far as the process goes, we are going from a haploid something to a haploid something, so this has got to be mitosis occurring there. Okay, then remember what gametophytes make. Gametophytes make gametes. So the megagametophyte is going to produce egg cells. The microgametophyte is going to produce sperm cells. Now remember, this is a little tricky here because before fertilization can happen, we've got to have pollination that happens, meaning the pollen tube meets up with the micropyle on the ovule. Okay, and then that pollen tube will release the sperm cells so that fertilization can happen about 12 to 15 months after pollination. And then that diploid zygote or embryo is going to be in a seed. And by mitosis, it is going to grow into your diploid sporophyte once again, which is your big pine tree. Okay, so that completes our cycle. That completes our notes for gymnosperms. While this is still fresh in your head, you should go ahead and do the gymnosperm review. I am still trying to decide how I'm going to assess you on that, but you will be assessed on that. So you've got to make sure you go ahead and do the review while it's still fresh in your brain. Thanks so much. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.